Good morning. I'm Brian LaPasse, Chief of Program Services at OPSC. Today I have Josh Potter and Tracy Sharp, operations managers in our program services division that are we're all helping out today. We're going to be facilitating the meeting and then helping out with questions and answers after each presentation. We're getting to the point now with these topics that we've developed regulations. We're proposing them, and they're in our items today. So I encourage you to pay close attention to those regulations. These are, they're not final yet. We're still working on them, of course, but that's all the more reason to give you or for us to get your input on all of them because these are going to be the rules that govern these new programs and these new grants. And so we're excited to have some regulations to show you today. In today's packet, you'll notice, and I think Josh has already linked it in the chat. There's a brief summary of the topics, and then we're going to have right behind that is going to be all the feedback that we received on the topics that we're discussing today. The actual items will start on page 17, on stamp page 17. So there's that cover page, and then some feedback that we received, and then the items are behind that. I want to say a sincere thank you to everyone who took the time and all the effort that you put out. It was clear that there was a lot of time and effort spent on them. We got a lot of really well-developed and thoughtful feedback. It was extremely valuable to us. Thank you so much for taking the time to do that. If you've been watching these meetings, I always harp on how important it is that we get your input, and it really is important. The feedback that we got in these topics was extremely useful. It helped us form what we hope are good proposals today, and that we're hoping that we get more. Maybe we don't need it in certain areas, but we're hoping that if there are some areas that you see, you notice that, send them back to us. So we want to thank you very much for all that. So today we will be talking. The first topic is 75-year-old buildings. It's a supplemental grant. This is new to the program in Prop 2 and provides what I would maybe call another milestone in the building's life cycle. In addition to the standard 20 or 25-year-old eligibility and then our 50-year-old eligibility, we now have 75-year-old eligibility. So there's a lot of important notes on this topic today. We're looking forward to presenting it to you. Anthony Froelich will be presenting that topic today. After that, we're going to have our supplemental grants for minimum essential facilities. As you guys all know out there, sometimes campuses are missing these other facilities that are non-classroom space, or perhaps the one that you do have is really not, it's too small to be used appropriately by that site that it's at. So this program will present some solutions for those situations. And we have Danny Souza presenting that item today. Lastly, but not least, we're going to be presenting the next iteration of the Transitional Kindergarten Supplemental Grant. So lots of supplementals today. It's another really cool feature of Prop 2, one that I'm sure a lot of you are interested in, and we have Vanessa Rodzwadowski presenting that topic. Looking forward to the discussion. Like I mentioned, we're at a really critical juncture here. These regulations that we're presenting are still in draft form. But we want to make sure that we get all the input we need to make them just as good as we can make them. So please pay attention. Thank you for being here. You'll notice that there's only 3 topics today. When these topics came around the first time, I think we presented it among 6 or 7 topics. We're taking that extra time to let them breathe a little bit and give you all an opportunity to really think about what we're presenting and provide that input. So again, we appreciate everybody being here. Looking forward to a great meeting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. He'll be sharing his screen.
All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Great. So as Brian had mentioned, I'm Anthony. And beginning on stamp page 17, today I will be discussing the modernization grant for 75 years or older buildings. This marks the second time we are bringing this topic back to stakeholders for further discussion and feedback. Our initial discussion took place on January 30th, during which staff discussed proposed criteria for determining the eligibility and funding for the modernization grant for buildings at least 75 years old. For reference, the full text of the item and a recording of the previous item can be found via the link shown here on the PDF. OPSC would like to thank all those who provided valuable feedback, and today I'll be highlighting a few of the questions and introduce a couple new items for discussion. This item includes all the questions that were received after the first meeting, along with OPSC's responses. OPSC encourages and welcomes any additional feedback. And now let's start by reviewing some of the questions and responses. The 75 years or older grant does not replace the 50 years or older grant. The grant is considered to be a supplemental grant, and its purpose is to replace 75 years or older buildings with newly constructed facilities. And similar to the 50-year-old or older pupil grant, the school site must have modernization eligibility in their baseline in order to request the grant. In cases where TK/kindergarten classrooms and the replaced buildings were originally 960 square feet, proposed program regulations have been drafted to accommodate the increase in square footage for the reconstructed 75 years or older building due to Title V requirements. In the previous item presented at the first meeting, staff proposed resetting a building's age to the apportionment date if it was replaced. After revisiting and further discussion, the age of the buildings will be calculated from the DSA approval date of construction plus an additional 12 months. And for portable facilities, the age will be based on the DSA approval date of when it was placed on the site, plus the additional 12 months. For question 8, regarding the use of an F3 level of difficulty for unit costs in preparing the cost-benefit analysis, OPSC will maintain consistency by continuing to apply the Sierra West current construction costs as currently used for modernization projects. The F3 level is specifically designed for addressing imminent health and safety threats where repairs are more complex and challenging to perform. In reference to Table 1 that was discussed during the initial stakeholder meeting, it was noted that the determination of existing square footage must be based on DSA plans. However, OPSC acknowledges that the original DSA plans may no longer be available, and in such cases, districts may develop and submit as-used plans such as conceptual or schematic drawings. These alternative plans will be considered acceptable documentation, allowing school districts to utilize them in preparing a cost-benefit analysis. For question 10 in the previous item at the initial meeting, staff proposed determining a building's usage based on its designation during the establishment, which we call the snapshot. After reevaluating this approach, staff has considered the methodology used in the seismic mitigation program, which evaluates a building based on its current usage rather than the snapshot, and staff proposes the same approach for the 75 years or older grant. Now we would like to bring attention and provide a little clarification to this item since it was originally presented at the first stakeholder meeting. OPSC has changed the proposal of this grant as being a standalone grant. Upon further review, staff has determined that the 75 years or older grant must be commensurate with available SFP modernization grants. This is similar to the 50 years or older grants, where the grants are considered a subset of the site's total eligibility and cannot exceed the total grant request in Section 2A on the Form 5004. In addition, the request must comply with modernization eligibility requirements in SFP Regulation Section 1859.79.3. Now, in order to provide the supplemental grant under the modernization program, staff is presenting a funding model that shows how the 75 years or older base grant is calculated from the new construction per pupil grant. As the base grant for new construction follows a 50-50 state district share basis, the 75 years or older supplemental grant will be processed under the modernization program on a 60-40 basis. And the conversion of the pupil grant amount is shown here on Table 1. This calculation allows for OPSC to maintain an accurate 60-40 split while incorporating the new construction grant amount for a modernization application. And like other SFP grants, this grant will be adjusted annually based on the statewide cost index for Class B construction. And below, Table 2 illustrates a sample calculation based on 2 K6 classrooms and 1 non-severe classroom. I'll pause here for a moment so you can review the tables. Now, the final topic to present for the modernization grant for 75 years or older buildings are the proposed regulations and regulatory amendments. Staff is proposing a new regulation section for 75 years or older funding, along with regulatory amendments to implement the statutory changes of the program eligibility and funding criteria. The proposed new SFP regulation section for the 75 years or older supplemental grant is 1859.78.65. This section establishes the criteria for approving funding requests for projects that demolish and replace buildings aged 75 years or older. Staff has also updated the following amendments to the SFP regulations that are impacted by the new statute. One thing to note is the proposed amendment to regulation section 1859.61 shown here is currently being further reviewed by OPSC and may not be necessary or included in the final regulation packet. The amendment to regulation section 1859.79.2A2 will be revised to align square footage provisions with Title V requirements, as the current SFP regulations do not allow increased square footage for modernization projects. In addition to those regulation updates, the Form 5004 will be revised to include sections specifically for the 75 years or older grant. Specifically, there will be a new section labeled 2D for the request of 75 years or older grants, which is similar to what the 5004 currently has for the request of 50-year-old grants. These new and updated proposed regulatory amendments and the updates to the Form SAB 5004 are highlighted and can be found in attachment A5B and A5C for reference. And with that, this concludes the presentation on the modernization grant for 75 years or older buildings, and we'll open it up for any questions.
Thanks, Anthony. You might want to scroll down to the regulations down there. I know the regulations are pretty technical language. Actually, maybe like the actual regs. I think if you keep going down. So I would
Let me get
encourage
those
all of
open.
you. I would encourage. Oh, I see. It's not in your attachment. It's okay. You can leave it there.
Okay.
I wanted to encourage everybody who's out there in the audience to take a look at the regulations when you have a chance, if you haven't already. I know it's really technical information, but if you want to look it over really carefully, we'd appreciate it. We spent tons of time on these. We had many eyes on them, but we're always looking for ways to make them a little bit more streamlined, or maybe we could reword something to be more clear. So if there's any kind of input you have on that, we welcome it. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now. Is there anybody out there with a question they'd like to ask verbally? I'll give you a little bit of time. I'm not seeing anything. As I like to kind of kid around, kind of kidding, kind of not. This always makes me feel good when we don't get a lot of questions in a way, because it shows that hopefully we did a good job. I think we did on this one. We've been very careful with this particular topic, with all the topics really, but with this one, we really spent a lot of time on this one, honing it in.
Brian, there's no questions down here.
Okay, thanks. There is a question in the chat. It says, The item notes aged based on DSA date. What if there was LPP funding on site building? I think, and Josh, jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're just basically aging these the same as we do any building. So if there was a lease purchase program phase C apportionment, we would be using that as the starting point for SFP purposes. Is that correct?
For this one, as if the 75-year building still exists, understanding that at the 20 and 25-year, or even at the 50-year, they may have just been modernized. And for the purposes of 75-year, we would actually look at that DSA date.
Okay.
So the construction, the DSA plan approval date, not redating for what we do for the typical modernization, because again, that's a purpose to modernize. How long does that building exist and need to be modernized? In this case, if it has been modernized, in essence, possibly those 2 times at that 20 or 25, and then potentially at that 50 for permanent structures. At this point in time, we would look at that replacement option available. It's not required, but if they're eligible and want to use that, we would allow that age to carry from the original construction based on that, again, DSA approval date plus 12 months.
Thank you. Great question, Jessica. Thanks for asking. Anyone else with a question before we move on? Okay, seeing none. If you think of something later, we could certainly go back to this topic. Thank you, Anthony, for the presentation. I am going to actually be sharing my screen now, and then we're going to go over to Danny to talk about minimum essential facilities. Give me just 1 second. There we go. All right, Danny.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. For those that don't know, my name is Danny, and today I'll be walking you through the potential funding options and calculations for the Minimum Essential Facilities Modernization Supplemental Grant, which starts on stamp page 48 of the item. To recap, OPSC held a stakeholder meeting on February 13th, 2025 to discuss the implementation of the Minimum Essential Facilities Supplemental Grant. This item continues that discussion and addresses the feedback OPSC received from stakeholders since the meeting. A summary of the stakeholder feedback and OPSC's responses are listed in a table beginning on page 49 of the item. Additionally, all stakeholder feedback may be found in attachment B of the item. This item also proposes 2 potential options for funding grant with calculations and examples for each project type, as well as necessary changes to current SFP regulations and the Form SAB 5004. The proposed regulations are available in attachment A10B for review. Our main focus today will be on the 2 potential options for funding and their calculations. We'll start this on page 54 of the item. First, I'll provide a brief overview of each option and then move on to the specific calculations and examples for each option and project type. Please note that we use the same criteria in each of the 4 examples provided today, and all of the grant amounts are based on the 2025 CCI. For comparison purposes, we also included an overview and example of the existing MEF use grants calculation pursuant to SFP regulation section 1859.77.3a, but we're not going to go into too much detail on that in this presentation. As mentioned in the item presented on February 13th, 2025, both options are limited to funding the lesser of the new space being constructed or the recommended size of the space based on the site's enrollment. Let's take a look at option 1. Under option 1, the supplemental grant amount is calculated using the permanent or portable other and toilet square foot grant amounts. As this is a modernization supplemental grant, the square foot grant amounts are utilized at a 60-40 split. A site-wide analysis of the existing toilet square footage will need to be conducted to determine if an existing site already meets the required toilet square footage for current enrollment to determine the fundable toilet square footage. Under option 2, a calculation to determine the maximum pupil grant amount for the facility, similar to the existing MEF use of grants calculation, would determine the supplemental grant amount. However, instead of using the new construction base grant amount, the calculation will use the modernization base grant amount. Please note that the site's modernization baseline eligibility would not be adjusted in any way because of this grant beyond the pupil grants that are requested in Section 2 of the 5004. Please see the comparison table we created on page 55 for more information. Now let's take a deeper look at each option, starting with option 1 on page 56. In option 1, the supplemental grant amount would be calculated using the permanent or portable other and toilet square foot grant amounts. New projects would be funded based on the lesser of the total size of the new MEF or the recommended size of the MEF based on current enrollment. Expansion projects would be funded based on the lesser of the delta between the existing MEF space and the total size of the expanded MEF, or the delta between the existing MEF space and the recommended size of the MEF based on current enrollment. To calculate the supplemental grant amount for new projects under option 1, first determine which is less, the recommended MEF size or the total square footage of the new facility. Next, calculate the amount of fundable toilet square footage by comparing the existing toilet square footage on the site with the recommended toilet square footage based on current seabeds according to the per pupil square footage allocation in the chart in SFP regulation section 1859.82.1b. A condensed version can also be found on page 54. A condensed version of the chart can also be found on page 54 of the item. Then multiply the lesser of the two by the other and toilet square foot grant amounts based on the construction type. Note that eligible toilet space will be funded first. And lastly, add the other and toilet square footage totals together for the total supplemental grant amount. Now let's go over an example of this on page 57. We have a middle school serving grades 7 through 8 with an enrollment of 1,250 students that does not have an MPR and is building a permanent MPR with food service that is 7,000 square feet, of which 1,000 square feet is toilet. For the purposes of this example, it is assumed that all toilet square footage is fundable. In order to determine the recommended MEF size, multiply the seabeds at the site, which is 1,250, by the per pupil square footage amount for the grade level. This again can be found in the square footage chart in SFP regulation section 1859.82.1b. And as I mentioned before, a condensed version of the chart can also be found on page 54 of the item. In this case, the per pupil square footage amount for an MPR at the middle school level is 5.3 square feet. The product of 1,250 multiplied by 5.3 square feet is 6,625 square feet. Therefore, the recommended size of the MPR MEF for this site is 6,625 square feet. The lesser between the recommended size of the MEF, which is 6,625 square feet, and what is actually being built, which is 7,000 square feet, is the recommended size. Now, in order to determine the grant amount, the 1,000 permanent toilet square feet is multiplied by the permanent toilet square foot grant amount of $559 for a total of $559,000. The remaining 5,625 of permanent other square feet is multiplied by the permanent other square foot grant amount of $312 for a total of $1,755,000. When added together, the total for supplemental grant is in the amount of $2,314,000. Now let's take a look at the calculation and example for expansion projects under option 1. To calculate the supplemental grant amount for expansion projects under option 1, first determine which is less, the delta between the existing MEF size and the recommended size, or the delta between the existing MEF size and the total size of the expanded facility. The delta is the square footage that is eligible to be funded. Next, same as we did in the last example, we'll determine the amount of fundable toilet square footage, and then multiply the lesser delta by the other and toilet square foot grant amounts based on the construction type. Same as in the new projects, same as for new projects, the eligible toilet space will be funded first. Lastly, add the other and toilet square footage totals together for the total supplemental grant amount. Now, let's go over an example of this on page 58. A middle school serving grades 7 through 8 with an enrollment of 1,250 students has an existing permanent MPR with food service that is 3,000 square feet, of which 350 square feet is toilet space, and is expanding it by 4,000 square feet, of which 650 square feet is toilet space. The newly expanded MPR will have a total of 7,000 square feet, of which 1,000 square feet is toilet space. For the purposes of this example, it is assumed that all toilet square footage is fundable. In order to determine the recommended MEF size, just like we did for new projects, we multiply the seabeds at the site by the per pupil square footage amount for the grade level. The per pupil square footage amount for an MPR at the middle school level is 5.3 square feet, and the product of 1,250 multiplied by 5.3 square feet is 6,625 square feet. Therefore, the recommended size of the MPR MEF is 6,625 square feet. The delta between the existing MEF square footage and the total size of the expanded facility is 4,000 square feet, and the delta between the existing MEF square footage and the recommended size is 3,625 square feet. Therefore, the lesser of the two and what is eligible to be funded is 3,625 square feet. To determine the grant amount, 650 permanent toilet square feet is multiplied by the permanent toilet square foot grant amount of $559 for a total of $363,350. The remaining 2,975 of permanent other square feet is multiplied by the permanent other square foot grant amount of $312 for a total of $928,200. These totals are added together for a total supplemental grant amount of $1,291,550. As we wrap up our review of option 1, there are some considerations on page 59 to keep in mind. First, by basing the funding on the permanent or portable other and toilet square footage amount that is being built, option 1 considers the actual type of space built when determining the supplemental grant amount. When a new project is funded based on the lesser of the size of the new facility and the recommended square footage, the grant only funds up to what is recommended. By considering the existing MEF space in an expansion project, the supplemental grant would not fund any work done to the existing space, only the lesser of the new square footage being built, or the delta between the existing and the recommended square footage would be funded. Funding within the program is made more consistent by aligning how MEF spaces are funded with how the facility hardship replacement and charter rehabilitation programs are funded. And lastly, option 1 differs from how existing MEF USA grants new construction applications are currently funded, as the existing MEF USA grants funding is determined by using per pupil grant amounts, and this calculation would fund using the permanent or portable other and toilet square foot grant amounts. Okay, now that we've gone over option 1, let's move on to page 60 and take a look at option 2. In option 2, the supplemental grant amount is determined by using a square footage calculation to determine the maximum pupil grant amount for the facility, similar to the existing MEF USA grants calculation. However, instead of using the new construction base grant amount, this calculation uses the modernization base grant amount. Again, please note that the site's modernization baseline eligibility would not be adjusted as a result of this grant beyond the pupil grants requested in section 2 of the 5004. Similar to option 1, new projects would be funded based on the lesser of the total size of the new MEF or the recommended size of the MEF based on current enrollment, and expansion projects would be funded based on the lesser of the delta between the existing MEF space and the total size of the expanded MEF, or the delta between the existing MEF space and the recommended size of the MEF based on current enrollment. To calculate the supplemental grant amount for new projects under option 2, first determine which is less, the recommended MEF size or the total square footage of the facility. Then multiply the lesser of the two by the other square foot grant amount based on the construction type. Note again that as this is a modernization supplemental grant, the square foot grant amounts will be utilized at a 60-40 split. Then divide that product by the modernization base grant amount for the project type and round up. That number is the maximum pupil amount for the facility. The supplemental grant amount is the maximum pupil amount for the facility multiplied by the modernization base grant amount for the project type. Now let's look at an example of this on page 61. A middle school serving grades 7 through 8 with an enrollment of 1,250 students does not have an MPR and is building a permanent MPR with food service that is 7,000 square feet. In order to determine the recommended MEF size, just like in option 1, we'll multiply the seabeds at the site by the per pupil square footage amount for the grade level. We know the per pupil square footage amount for an MPR at the middle school level is 5.3 square feet, and the product of 1,250 multiplied by 5.3 square feet is 6,625 square feet. Therefore, again, the recommended size of the MPR MEF for this site is 6,625 square feet. The lesser of the recommended size, which is 6,625 square feet, and the new facility, which is 7,000 square feet, is the recommended size. To determine the maximum pupil amount for the facility, multiply the recommended MEF size by the permanent other square foot grant amount of $312 for a total of $2,067,000. Then divide that amount by the modernization base grant amount of $6,381 and round up. The result is 324. That's the maximum pupil amount for the facility. To determine the grant amount, multiply 324 by the modernization base grant amount of $6,381. The total supplemental grant amount is $2,067,444. Now let's take a look at the calculation and example for expansion projects under option 2. First, determine which is less, the delta between the existing MEF size and the recommended MEF size, or the delta between the existing MEF size and the total size of the expanded facility. Then multiply the lesser of the two by the other square foot grant amount based on the construction type. Divide that by the modernization base grant amount and round up. That number is the maximum pupil amount for the facility. The total supplemental grant amount is the maximum pupil amount for the facility multiplied by the modernization base grant amount. Let's take a look at an example of this on page 62. A middle school serving grades 7 through 8 with an enrollment of 1,250 students has an existing MPR with food service that is 3,000 square feet and is expanding it by 4,000 square feet. The newly expanded MPR will have a total of 7,000 square feet. In order to determine the recommended MEF size, like we did before, multiply the seabeds at the site by the per pupil square footage amount for the grade level, which we know from the previous examples is 5.3 square feet. The product again of this calculation is 6,625 square feet. Therefore, the recommended MPR MEF size is 6,625 square feet. The delta between the existing MEF square footage and the total size of the expanded facility is 4,000 square feet, and the delta between the existing MEF square footage and the recommended MEF size is 3,625 square feet. Therefore, the lesser of the two and what is eligible to be funded is 3,625 square feet. To determine the maximum pupil amount, multiply 3,625 by the permanent other square foot grant amount of $312 for a total of $1,131,000. Divide that by the modernization base grant amount of $6,381 and round up. The result is 178. This is the maximum pupil amount for the facility. To determine the grant amount, multiply 178 by the modernization base grant amount of $6,381. The total supplemental grant amount is $1,135,818. As we wrap up our review of option 2, there are some considerations on page 63 to keep in mind. First, option 2 is most similar to how the existing MEF use of grants request is currently funded. The main difference is that this option utilizes the modernization base grant amount instead of the new construction base grant amount to determine funding. Second, option 2 does not differentiate between other and toilet square footage being built like in option 1. Instead, it focuses on total square footage. All of the permanent space is funded at the same amount, and all of the portable space is funded at the same amount. Lastly, by considering the existing MEF space in an expansion project, only the new square footage being built, not to exceed the recommended MEF size, is funded. And that wraps up our review of option 2. As I mentioned before, we've included an overview and an example of the existing MEF use of grants calculation starting on page 63. We also included a table on page 65 that summarizes the funding outcomes of option 1, option 2, and the existing MEF use of grants calculation for comparison. And also on page 65, we included our staff recommendation. OPSC is recommending option 1. We've identified 3 factors to be considered when determining funding for the grant: the size of the facility constructed, the type of construction, whether it's permanent or portable, and the type of square footage within the facility, toilet versus non-toilet or other. In our opinion, option 1 considers all 3 factors and aligns the grant funding most closely with the project scope by basing the funding on the amount of permanent or portable, other, and toilet square footage that's being built. While option 2 also factors in square footage as it differentiates between permanent or portable construction, it does not account for the amount of other or toilet square footage construction. And lastly, option 1 allows for additional consistency within the program by aligning how MEF spaces are funded with how the facility hardship replacement and charter rehabilitation programs are funded. And while I'm not going to go into too much detail in this presentation, starting on page 66, we've included a summary of the proposed changes to the existing SFP regulations and the Form SAB 5004. Please note that attachment A10B of the item includes the full proposed amendments to the SFP regulations. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. We welcome any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you, Danny. That was a really clear presentation. I really appreciate that.
Thanks.
So yeah, basically, these two methods are pretty similar. One of them is a straight square footage calculation. The other one converts square footage into per pupil grants. It's a little bit different, but pretty similar. So I think it's clear. Danny outlined it very clearly why we're presenting option 1 as our preferred option. That said, is there anybody else out there with any thoughts or considerations for us? Again, I highly encourage everybody to take a look through the regulations. They're really hard to cover in a meeting like this because, to be honest, if we were to go through every line of the proposed regs, we could be here for several days. There's a lot of topic in here. There's a lot of things to think about. So I encourage you all to take your time going through them and to really consider all the factors that you would think are the most important and that we've covered them and that they're clear to you. I think that being most important is that if you agree with those rules, we want to make sure that they're very clear and that they read the way that you would expect them to. So please take the time to do that if you do have that time available.
Brian, there's no questions down here.
All right, thanks. I'm not seeing any in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the next topic. Again, if anything pops up in your mind, please feel free to throw it into the chat or speak up, and I'm happy to address it. I know there's a lot of, like I've said it a million times already, I'm repeating myself over and over, but there's a lot of technical stuff here. So, we understand that it might take you some time to absorb it. Okay, moving on. Our third topic today is the Transitional Kindergarten Supplemental Grant. I will be turning this over to Vanessa.
Good morning. Thank you, Brian. My name is Vanessa Rozwadowski, and I am one of the project managers for the California Preschool Transitional Kindergarten Full-Day Kindergarten Facilities Grant Program, if you can say that 5 times fast, or as we'll refer to it in this item, the FTK program. I will be walking us through the proposed implementation strategies and regulatory amendments for the TK Supplemental Grant, We will also address the comments received from stakeholders since our last meeting, and we'll be starting on page 80 of the item if you would like to follow along. As a reminder, AB 247 amended Ed Code section 17073.16 to allow for a supplemental grant for the retrofit or new construction of transitional kindergarten classrooms for districts receiving an apportionment for modernization funding. The entirety of that authority can be found on page 86 of the stakeholder item. And again, I just want to express my thanks to everyone who provided feedback either during or after our previous stakeholder meeting. And the questions and comments to be addressed will begin on page 81 of our item. We'll start with question number 1 regarding the feasibility of utilizing a 60-40 model for the new construction TK classrooms funded through the TK supplemental grant. OPSC has explored this option and devised a methodology that allows for a 60-40 model, and we'll go over this in more detail on page 83 of the item. Also, please excuse the typo in our answer section here. It should say 83 instead of 3. So, thanks. For question number 2, concerning Title V exemptions for retrofitted classrooms under 1,250 square feet, to maintain consistency with the FTK program, retrofitted classrooms shall not be less than 1,250 square feet, and exemptions will not be provided for classrooms that are under that square footage amount. For question number 3, regarding the reimbursement of TK projects with contracts signed prior to July 3rd, 2024, because statute was chaptered on July 3rd, 2024, reimbursement will be limited to projects with construction contracts on or after this date. This is consistent with past implementation of new statutes as amendments to SFP regulations by the SAB. Additionally, stakeholder feedback received during and after our February 13th meeting included support for a pupil grant funding model based on the current FTK program for the TK supplemental grant. So this model uses new construction or modernization pupil grant amounts and state loading standards of 25 pupils per classroom to determine grant funding amounts. OPC considered the options presented and did concur with the stakeholders' preference. And so below, we'll be going through some examples of how the TK supplemental grant would be incorporated into an existing modernization project. So example 1 illustrates a modernization application requesting 101 pupil grants and retrofitting one existing 50-year-old classroom into a Title V compliant TK classroom. The top portion of the table displays the mod grant base total of approximately $600 something. The TK supplemental grant section requests 25 pupil grants for the retrofit of one TK classroom and corresponding eligible additional grants to augment that supplemental. The total state share is the sum of the TK supplemental grant subtotal, the mod subtotal, and the project assistance grant that you see at the bottom. The state and district shares would follow the typical modernization 60-40 state-district split. Okay, moving on to example number 2. This one it's similar to example number 1. However, because it is a new construction of a TK classroom, OPC has adjusted the new construction pupil grant amounts to reflect a 60-40 state district share in lieu of the current 50-50 new construction pupil grants associated with new construction projects. Similar to the 75-year-old supplemental grant, this calculation would allow for OPSC to maintain an accurate 60-40 split while incorporating a new construction project into an existing modernization application. So table 1, right here, it says base grant conversion from new construction to modernization. This reflects the increase in per pupil grant amounts that have been adjusted specifically for new construction TK classrooms as part of the supplemental grant. These grant amounts would be adjusted annually with the CCI update every year. And Table 2 illustrates a modernization application, again requesting 101 pupil grants and a supplemental fire alarm grant. And again, the top portion of the table displays the mod base grant subtotal of approximately $600-something thousand. The TK supplemental grant requests 25 pupil grants for the construction of 1 TK classroom and corresponding eligible additional grants to augment the supplemental. The total state share is the sum of the TK supplemental subtotal, the mod subtotal, and the project assistance grant. The state and district shares follow the typical modernization 60-40 split because the TK supplemental grants have already been adjusted to account for that conversion grant difference from 50-50 to 60-40. And so moving down to our proposed regulatory amendment. Section 1859.51 includes the adjustment to the new construction baseline eligibility as a result of constructing new TK classrooms. Newly constructed classrooms funded under the FDK program were not included in the new construction baseline pursuant to Ed Code Section 17375. However, newly constructed TK classrooms funded through the TK supplemental grant in a modernization project will be included in the district's new construction baseline. Amendments to the SFP regulations will include language to address these adjustments. For Section 1859.77.6, this one is an entirely new section for the TK supplemental grant. Because the amended Ed Code directly cites Section 17375 for the FDK program, our proposed SFP regulation amendments closely mirror FDK program regulations for TK classrooms. And consistent with those FDK program regulations, OPSC is also proposing that the supplemental grant be limited to 4 classrooms per school site to prevent excessive use of modernization funding to add new classrooms. Districts may elect to use the new construction eligibility to construct additional TK classrooms if needed, though. Future amendments to the Form 5004 will include a certification acknowledging this provision. And then lastly, in addition to exemptions for allowing new building area for the 75-year-old and the MEF supplemental grants, OPSC is proposing Section 1859.79.2 be amended to include an exclusion for TK classrooms. New building area by nature would be needed to retrofit an existing classroom to meet Title V compliance or construct a new TK classroom funded under the supplemental grant. And so I know that was kind of short, but that really about covers it and concludes my presentation. Again, I'd just like to express thanks for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share them now or via an email to our communications team. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you very much. This is I know it's an exciting topic for a lot of people out there, and it's much needed out there in the field. So thank you so much. I think we're starting to get honed in on this one. Let's see. I think we have a comment in the dining room, and then there's also one in the chat that we can take the one in the dining room first.
Hi, everyone. Rebecca Colleen with Coalition for Adequate School Housing. Thank you, Vanessa, for a great presentation on this item. Cash is generally comfortable with the way this is going. We agree with option 2 out of the options that have been presented previously, so we appreciate that. And the one question that I had for you was, in using the pupil grant approach, I'm just curious if you thought about the cost that's associated with the increased space since the size of these classrooms are bigger. So our pupil grant is generally being used for 960 square foot classrooms. These are larger classrooms. I was just curious if you all thought about a way to kind of look at that in the context of option 2.
Thanks,
Go ahead, sorry.
No, you go ahead and finish.
I was just going to say, I mean, I know we looked at the square footage approach in option 1. We agree that option 2 is, providing a better path forward in in this supplemental grant. But, you know, just thinking about that calculation here, it's reflective of what we typically see in a 960 square foot classroom, right? So just, is there a way to think about the increased costs associated with the increased square footage in these facilities?
We can definitely take that under consideration and see where, yeah, we can definitely take it under consideration because we had heard previously that it was more desirable to go this way, but I think it merits a second look. So thank you for that suggestion, Rebecca.
Yeah, and Tracy, I want to be clear, like, we agree with using the pupil grant approach. I'm
Yeah.
just, you know, I'm just thinking about, oh, well, these grants are based on typically a 960 square foot classroom.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the comment.
And then I'll just read out the comment or the chat or the question, I should say, that we got in the chat. Ilana asks, is there a way to give districts the option to request 35% for site development or base it on the SFP site development worksheet? So it'd be one or the other.
Oh, we can definitely consider that option as well. I don't recall if that was in our prior item or not, but we can take that into consideration as well.
Yeah. Look at. Any other comments out there or questions? I'll remind everyone, we typically take feedback on these items for 2 weeks. We have received some feedback outside of that window on past items, which isn't really that big of a deal. We hope to get them within 2 weeks so we can turn them around for the next meeting, though. So if we do get something that comes in after that, we might or might not be able to wrap it into the next meeting we have on each topic. We're going to be having another meeting next week on April 10th. The topics will be, I think, released shortly. I'm not sure if they have been yet. I don't think they have. We're still finalizing a little bit of that stuff too. So we're working to turn these around as quickly as we can. As you can imagine, when we get into this stage of them, the regulatory development process takes a lot of time, and we like to take our time on it to make them the best they can be. There's just a lot of things to consider, and there's a lot of nuance to developing regulations. So we'll be working on those as quickly as we can. The plan for each of these topics is to present them to you either 3 or 4 times before we take them to the state allocation board for approval. Normally we like to introduce the topic, and then in the next couple meetings after that, we really get into the nitty gritty like we did today. So again, can't emphasize enough, please take a look at those regulations and see what you think about them if you do have the time for that. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. We're not even to an hour yet. We have plenty of time. So I'm just going to give it another minute. We can go back to one of the last other topics too. If anybody wants to bring back the 75-year-old building topic or the MEF topic, we still have plenty of time to address those questions as well. Okay, seeing none. Thank you all for being here. Really means a lot to us that you take the time to invest your important time with us to make these rules. We appreciate the interest in the program, and we'll be seeing you again next week, I believe, with 3 different other topics. So we're looking forward to that. And in the meantime, have a great weekend. Enjoy the weather. It's going to be a beautiful weekend, and we will see you all again very soon.